The Young and the Restless spoilers. For years, Genoa City had existed in the background of Traci's thoughts like a melody she once loved but couldn't bear to hear again. The memories she carried were soft and aching, tangled between fleeting moments of happiness and the deep, bitter solitude that had followed. It had been some time since her name had been whispered through the corridors of the Abbott estate, or since her presence had stirred unease in Kane's carefully guarded composure. But as news spread that Traci was planning to return, old dust that had long settled on the past began to rise again, shifting the air around those who once played parts in her story. For most, Traci's return would seem harmless, perhaps even welcome, a quiet homecoming for someone who had always been the heart of her family. But for Kane, it was anything but that. His life had changed, rearranged into a delicate house of cards, and Traci, with her knowing eyes and buried truth, was a storm he wasn't prepared to weather. What the others didn't know, what even those closest to the Abbotts had never guessed, was that Traci hadn't just disappeared after Kane left her behind. She hadn't simply retreated in grief. She had gone to Paris. She had gone there to give birth. Alone. Years ago, during what everyone believed was just a short-lived romance, a literary collaboration turned affectionate distraction, Traci had allowed herself to fall in love with Kane. She knew it had been a foolish thing, an affair with a man who was grieving, directionless, and emotionally unavailable. But in the safety of late-night writing sessions, laughter over manuscripts, and shared vulnerability, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt chosen. She felt desired. She felt seen. For a brief, shining moment, she let herself believe it could be real. But Kane, as always, was searching for something that wasn't her. When the fantasy began to crack, he vanished without goodbye, leaving her not just heartbroken, but pregnant. She had thought of telling him then. She had written a letter, one of many, then tore them to shreds in the middle of the night. She had imagined calling his name at the airport, chasing him through the terminal, telling him he was going to be a father, but instead, she boarded a flight to Paris and erased herself from his world. The child, her son, was now 10 years old. His name was Gabriel, a name chosen in a moment of prayer, because she had needed guidance and strength, and he had become both. He had Kane's eyes, though she had told herself that was just her imagination playing cruel tricks. His temperament was quiet, watchful, intense, everything Kane had been when they met, before the lies and the betrayal. Traci had raised Gabriel with every ounce of love she had left, and though the pain of doing it alone never left her, she found purpose again in being a mother. But Gabriel was getting older now, asking questions she could no longer answer with half-truths. He wanted to know about his father. He wanted to know why he had no last name that connected him to the rest of his family. And Traci, never one to lie, found herself trapped in the prison of the secret she had kept for too long. So she returned. Not for closure, not for drama, but for the truth, for her son. She had told no one the full story, not even Jack, who had always been her shield and protector. She simply arrived at the Abbott estate one morning, luggage in hand, face pale but resolved, and quietly announced that she was back for an extended stay. The news was met with warmth, cautious joy, and 100 questions she refused to answer. The only person who seemed visibly unsettled was Kane, who had, perhaps, sensed this reckoning coming before anyone else did. He didn't welcome her. He didn't avoid her. He simply stood very still when she walked into the room, eyes locked with hers, and said nothing. And that silence was all the answer she needed. He knew. She hadn't intended to throw it in his face. She hadn't planned on demanding anything from him. But the moment she saw him again, the way he looked right through her like she was part of a history he'd rather forget, something inside her snapped. She told him the truth. Not with rage or bitterness, but with heartbreaking simplicity. That he had a son. That the boy lived in Paris. That she had given birth alone, raised him without a penny of support, never asked for anything because she knew he never loved her. But now the child was old enough to ask questions, and she would not lie to him. The child deserved to know who his father was. That was all. Kane's reaction was not anger or guilt, but cold disbelief. He didn't accuse her of lying, that would have been too easy. Instead, he said he believed her. He said the timing made sense. He said he would want to meet the boy. But he made it clear, with the kind of careful cruelty that only Kane could deliver, that he would never be part of a family with Traci. That whatever they had shared had been a moment, a mistake. And that he had moved on. He said he'd support the child if necessary, emotionally, financially, even publicly, but that Traci needed to understand nothing about his life had room for her in it now. And it was in that moment, standing in the middle of the Abbott living room under the weight of 1,000 secrets, that Traci realized she wasn't just asking Kane to step up as a father. Somewhere deep down, she had been hoping he might still see her. That he might look at her and remember the woman who had once loved him without condition. And he didn't. The fallout was quiet but devastating. Jack was furious, not at Traci, but at Kane. For all his faults, Jack had always believed that Traci deserved peace, and now here she was, more broken than ever. Ashley, ever the realist, said nothing at first, only asking what Traci planned to do next. And Traci, to everyone's surprise, said she would be taking Gabriel to Genoa City after all. That the boy deserved to meet his father, even if his father would never be anything more than a man in a photograph with a familiar face. She said she was done protecting Kane from the consequences of the life he built on charm, manipulation, and emotional distance. It was time Gabriel saw who he came from, both the good and the bad. Kane, meanwhile, found his carefully curated reality beginning to unravel. His new relationships, his business ventures, even his role in Lily's orbit, all began to feel tainted by the shadow of what he had ignored. People whispered. Colleagues stared. His name once again became synonymous with abandonment and selfishness. And perhaps most disturbingly, when he did finally meet Gabriel, the boy with his eyes and his quiet strength, something inside him shifted. Not enough to change. Not enough to repair what was broken between him and Traci. But enough to remind him that there were pieces of himself he had scattered across the world, and that someday they might come back to haunt him. Traci never expected a fairy tale. She never believed Kane would fall to his knees and beg for a second chance. But she had hoped, somewhere deep in the recesses of her wounded heart, that maybe, just maybe, he would see the gift she had carried in silence for over a decade. And in the end, perhaps he did, just not in the way she wanted. As she walked through the Abbott Gardens that summer evening, watching her son chase fireflies under the glow of the lanterns, she knew she had done the right thing. She had told the truth. She had brought light into the darkness. And though Kane could never be the man she once dreamed of, she was no longer the woman who waited in silence. She was a mother. She was a survivor. And for the first time in years, she was finally, undeniably free. Let me know if you'd like a continuation where Gabriel begins forming a bond with other Abbott family members, or if Traci and Kane are pulled into a new business or custody battle. I can continue the story in any direction you wish. There had been many questions over the years that Traci had grown used to dodging. Questions about her travels, about the father she never mentioned, about why her son's name didn't match anyone else's. But the question that pierced her soul every single time it came, always gentle, always innocent, was when Gabriel would quietly ask her, "Why don't I have a dad like the other kids?" It was never shouted in anger, never accompanied by tears. It was simply a longing, a gap he felt but didn't understand, and that made it all the more painful. Traci had learned to smile through it, to offer vague stories about different kinds of families, to shift the conversation toward things she could control. But she knew that silence was beginning to erode the foundation of trust she had so carefully built with her son. Children, no matter how gentle their souls, know when the truth is being hidden from them. So when she looked into Gabriel's eyes that morning in Paris and saw not just curiosity, but quiet disappointment, she made the decision that would change everything. She told him the truth. That his father was alive. That his name was Cain. That he lived in a place called Genoa City and that once, long ago, Traci had loved him. She told it simply, honestly, without bitterness or embellishment. And Gabriel, wide-eyed and silent, simply nodded and asked if he could meet him. Not because he had dreams of perfect reunions or fairy tales, but because he wanted to know who he was. Traci didn't cry then. She had done enough crying over Cain to fill an ocean. But when Gabriel quietly reached out to hold her hand and said, "I still only need you, Mom," her heart cracked open in a way it hadn't in years. Returning to Genoa City with that truth in the open changed everything. Traci was no longer a woman carrying a secret. She was a mother bringing her son to face the man who had unknowingly abandoned him. She didn't come with demands. She didn't want child support or legal claims or reconciliation. What she wanted was far simpler, to show her son where he came from, and then walk away if she had to. Her strength wasn't born from revenge or resentment. It was born from the years she had spent raising a child alone and learning that she was enough. Cain, on the other hand, was unprepared. He had faced corporate takedowns, heartbreaks, public humiliation, but nothing in his life had ever leveled him the way the sight of Gabriel did. The boy was standing in the Abbott living room, his expression calm and distant, eyes flickering between curiosity and something deeper, maybe fear. Cain saw himself in that boy. Not just physically, though the resemblance was undeniable, but in the way Gabriel seemed to take in the room before speaking, as though measuring who could be trusted. It terrified him. And for the first time in years, Cain was speechless. He turned to Traci, stunned, overwhelmed, and barely whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" Traci answered with grace. "Because I knew you didn't love me. And I didn't want to beg for space in a life that had already moved on. But he has a right to know who you are. And you have a right to decide what you do with that." Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't look away. And Cain, who had always been able to manipulate, charm, or outmaneuver any emotional situation, suddenly found himself completely powerless. In the days that followed, something shifted in Cain. He tried to approach Gabriel carefully, offering gifts, questions, nervous smiles. But Gabriel was not easily bought, nor did he want anything more than honesty. It was Traci's unwavering patience and her quiet dignity that began to haunt Cain. She wasn't asking him for anything. And that, more than anything else, broke him. One evening, after Gabriel had gone to bed, Cain arrived unannounced at the Abbott home. Traci was sitting in the parlor, a photo album in her lap. When she looked up, she expected confrontation. Instead, Cain sank to his knees in front of her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for leaving without a word, for making you carry this alone. I didn't know, Traci. And even if I had, I wasn't the man I needed to be back then. But I see him now, that boy, our son, and I don't know how to make this right." Traci didn't cry. She didn't reach out. She simply closed the album and said, "You don't have to make it right. You just have to be honest with him." Then, quietly, Cain stood and asked if he could see Gabriel. He walked into the boy's room like a man walking into a church, every step heavy with guilt and hope. Gabriel was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, as though he had been waiting. Cain didn't speak at first. He sat beside him, silent. Then, carefully, he put a hand on his shoulder. Gabriel didn't flinch. "I'm your dad," Cain said, voice raw. "And I know I wasn't there. I can't change that. But I want to try now, if you'll let me." There was a long pause before Gabriel turned and leaned into him, arms wrapping around Cain's waist. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for Cain, it was enough to collapse into tears he had been holding in for years. Outside the room, Traci listened, one hand pressed against the doorframe, her heart split between sadness and quiet joy. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't expect Cain to become a perfect father or suddenly fall in love with her again. But she had brought the truth into the light. She had given her son the gift of knowing where he came from. And more importantly, she had proven to herself and to Cain that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply endures. Let me know if you'd like the next part to show Gabriel integrating into the Abbott family, how Lily reacts, or if Traci receives an unexpected offer to publish a memoir about motherhood and hidden truths. I can build this into a multi-part arc depending on where you'd like it to go next.